Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Mike's Chess Videos. Today I'm going to show you an excerpt. This is actually not an excerpt, it's a full game that I played, but it's an excerpt from a lesson that I gave. So in this lesson I was teaching one of my students about the Sicilian opening, um, which is obviously a very popular, strong opening from the black perspective. And of course, in this game, we were playing as black, exploring the Sicilian. And I basically, after showing him various lines of the Sicilian, wanted to show him how the game can be played, how an actual game can be played. So we played from the black side, and the opponent opened up with e4. And of course, we played c5. This characterizes the Sicilian opening. The opponent develops his knight to f3, and we played d6. This is mainline Sicilian. We were angling for the dragon Sicilian, which is a sub variation of the Sicilian, which is neither here nor there for the purposes of this video. And that's because he played bishop c4, which means we're straight away, we have been taken away from the dragon variation. We're no longer in line with dragon. We are in some other variation. I don't know the name of it. I had a quick Google and I couldn't actually see a name for this variation other than, an early bishop c4. And I didn't know how to respond to this. So as a teacher of chess, as someone who's just been giving someone essentially a lecture in the Sicilian opening, and these are some certain ideas in the Sicilian, particularly in the dragon, how you might want to fianchetto the bishop and make use of this beautiful long diagonal, and how you want to develop your knights and how you want to develop the rest of your pieces and so forth and so on. Then we get this early bishop c4 and it throws away everything else that we had just been discussing. And now we are firmly operating in uncharted waters, purely on the basis of the principles of chess, which in a way is what I wanted him to find out through this game, is that opening preparation is one thing, studying opening lines is one thing, but actually playing a game against an opponent who isn't going to do what you expect them to do is something else. Okay, so I asked him how he wanted to respond here, and I had a couple sort of lines I would be happy to go down. He wanted to play knight c6, and that was one of the ones I'm happy to try. At this point, the opponent plays c3. I explained to my student that the likelihood is this move is preparing d4. It possibly prepares b4, but most likely it's going to prepare d4, having it advanced in the center, supported by the pawn. And perhaps after that pawn recaptures, the knight wants to land there. At the moment, the knight cannot land there, however. Okay, and I again asked my student what he wanted to play, and his answer was knight f6. I was very happy to play that, just putting pressure on this pawn. And that takes advantage of the fact that the knight can no longer develop there. Normally you would want the knight to come here. That would be very common, and from here the knight defends the pawn. The fact that he's played c3 means the knight can't come here, which means that now this attacked pawn cannot be defended by this knight. And white doesn't care. White decided he didn't want to defend this pawn. He instead sacrificed his bishop, and this is where things got interesting. Okay, now it wouldn't really make sense just to run the king into the center of the board, away from the bishop, in the same line of fire potentially on the d file as the queen. The only other option is to take the bishop. So this is a very forcing move. And of course, that's what we did. We took the bishop. When I say we, I kind of mean me, demonstrating to my student, though. At this point, the onslaught continued. White played queen b3 check, and the king cannot make use of the g8 square because that's covered by the queen, which means the options are, and you can't come here either because of this. So the options are either come out this way and, essentially invite white to find a checkmate, which they probably will be able to find when you start bringing your king out here early in the game. I mean, good luck to you. Or you can come back towards the center Neither of those seemed particularly appealing. But what other options are there? I mean, we could consider playing the bishop here, but in that case, there's this move. Check. King has to move. It doesn't matter where the king moves. I just say here, for example, then the bishop falls with checkmate. And if you move the king somewhere else, let's say this, well, then the bishop just falls regardless, and you'll end up at least down a pawn. The queen and the bishop are both hit at the very least. The king can't castle. It's not a good position for black, as far as I can tell. So essentially, what I told my student and what I'm sort of relaying now is that what's happened is white has used a very forcing move, a sacrificial move, giving up certain material in exchange for forcing black into a very dangerous situation. It's dangerous because it's easy for black to go wrong. It's easy to play a move like this to defend. But it's kind of awkward to play king e8, which is the move that we opted to play. Another option would have been to block with this pawn, but sort of gave away the ending there. But we opted just to play king e8 and play the game on. Okay, well, white continues the onslaught, playing very aggressively with knight g5. And the threat here was that he could plant a knight on f7, attacking both the queen and the rook. And this is what I told my student. I said, look, we need to be very careful here. Clearly, white has a dangerous attack. And if we make the wrong step, we could get crushed. So everything we have to do here is pay very close attention. The move queen f7 looks scary, but it's not a checkmate because the king can always escape up via d7 and possibly come around this way in future, or otherwise the situation can become diffused. So really, this is the real threat, forking both the queen and the rook. And for that reason, at this point, my student didn't know how to respond. So this is where I really took over with rook g8. It's guarded by the knight, and it takes the sting out of this move because now if he plays knight f7, all I have to do is move the queen. And if I move the queen, life is good. Okay. Well, he went in with his queen instead. Like I said, we've got this square, so I make use of it. And here he jumped in and took the pawn. So, okay, he's won back a little bit of material. Remember, initially he traded his bishop for this pawn that was here. Now he's got another pawn for the bishop. So at the moment, I got a bishop. He's got 2 pawns and an attack, something called the initiative. He has the initiative. He's kind of controlling how the play is going. He's just taken this knight. And again, if I'm not careful, things can go downhill rapidly. For instance, if I take the knight, say goodbye to your rook. Okay, and then he's winning. So we do have to be really careful. And in this situation, I mean, knowing that, and knowing that, if I just do something like this to try and free up my bishop, well, then he's going to take the knight here. And if I take that knight back, again, he's going to take the rook. So there was a definite threat here. And in the end, I realized what I needed to do was actually bring the rook back to its first square, bring it back to h8. Because no longer can this knight land here in one single move. The knight cannot come here and fork both of these pieces anymore. That's no longer a threat. And because that's no longer a threat, the rook is now actually safe here. Now he can take the knight, which he did, okay, with check, and all I do is recapture. And now the situation looks very different. Very different indeed. Okay, so one thing that my student noticed at this point was that I only had 2 minutes 23 on the clock, whereas the opponent had over 10 minutes left. And my student had seen what had happened in this game. He'd seen my king get pushed around violently from its starting point to f7, back to e8, now to d7. He'd seen the knights get traded. He'd seen my rook get pushed from h8 to g8 and back to h8. And he'd seen me be low on the clock. And he said, I don't think you're doing very well. I don't think you're doing very well. And I will admit, I was a bit worried. My ego was on the line here. My pride was on the line. I'm supposed to be your teacher. Do I know what I'm doing here or not? Well, as it turns out, if you look at these moves with a computer, I actually played a very good defensive game and ultimately a nice attacking game at the end as well, as we'll see. But just generically from this perspective, look at his pieces. He's got a knight here, which really has no prospects unless it wants to develop out to the side of the board, which is possible. It's got a bishop, which is entirely hemmed in. Can't do anything. Okay. And he's got a queen over here, essentially in no man's land, because it's not threatening anything anymore. And yet it's all alone, which means it's somewhat vulnerable, even to ideas like this potentially. And all I really need to do is move my king away, get my bishop out, get my queen in. My pieces can come out pretty quickly and really get a strong counterattack, not to mention the fact that I already have a bishop for the price of 2 pawns. So even though my student was kind of worried here, this is where I realized that I had weathered the storm and that the initiative that White originally had, as compensation for sacrificing his bishop, had run out. And now the tables are going to start to turn. So he castles, and I try and move my king to a safer square and get my bishop out potentially. And he tries to open the position, striking in the center with his pawn, as well as opening up his dark squared bishop. I took that pawn. He took back, and I took this pawn. I was very aware that even though he can give a check here, it doesn't lose the knight, because the knight, instead of the king running away, the knight can jump back. So I did calculate that before I took the pawn. He didn't play that move. He instead attacked the knight like so, whilst developing his bishop. Again, playing very, very aggressive chess. And again, I've only got 1:30 on the clock, and that's because I've been having to be very careful in this game. Okay, so instead of moving the knight, I can't defend it with the pawn because actually this pawn is pinned by his queen. So that pawn's useless. There's no other way to defend the knight other than moving it away somewhere. Possibly here to hit the rook and then come back and take the bishop. That was definitely on my mind. Or in fact, in hindsight, coming here would seem to win the rook, but I also mentioned to my student that if we do come here looking for the rook, well, now this queen move actually will win the knight because we can't jump the knight back. The only thing we can do is run out of the way and give the knight up. So that's not going to work. So again, we have to be very careful. Well, the move that I came up with was bishop e6, defended by the knight, attacking the queen. So now if you take my knight, I'm going to take your queen. Too bad. So instead, he gives a check, which is inserting an intermediate move. So a check, all right, I'll step out of the way. Now, I didn't come this way because I didn't want this rook to become hemmed in. Okay, and I also realized that these pawns are a shelter of sorts to my king. His queen is under attack. I'm threatening this move, which would fork the king and the rook. So I feel like this is the better move. I can bring the other rook over, and I'm starting to feel very good here. He moves his queen out of the way, and I did, in fact, jump into that square with a beautiful fork. He moves his king out of the way. I take the rook. He takes back. And now I move the rook, which is thankfully not hemmed in by the king, over to c8, with a threat not only to take a bishop, but that would in fact be checkmate. So the threat here is checkmate. Now all of a sudden the tables are turning. White no longer has the initiative. Now I have the initiative. The only trouble is I've also only got 28.5 seconds left on the clock compared to him, who still has over 10 minutes. So at this point, I kind of had to stop explaining everything to my student and sort of played pretty quickly and explained it to him later. But this is what happened. White developed the knight. So, okay, I can no longer just take and it's not going to be checkmate. I mean, I could take that, absolutely, ruin his pawn structure, give back a little bit of material, still be ahead in material. That would be an option. But instead, I developed the queen attacking this pawn. Okay, now he brings the queen back to defend the pawn. but he's given up control of this square, which is now only seen by his bishop. So I develop this bishop, since it can't come out this way. Let's bring it this way and attack his bishop. He goes for a trade, and then I really don't know why he played this move exactly, but it was a mistake. Now I double up my rooks. I'm looking to go for a check, and there might be tactics after that. So he pushes the pawn down. Now I bring the rook over here where it's supported by my bishop and attacks his queen. He moves his queen out of the way, losing track of the fact that this pawn hangs. So I take the pawn. Now I'm actually threatening checkmate, supported by the rook. So he gives one check, and I just step out of the way. Okay, sure, you can take this pawn, but you're going to get checkmated. So actually, you can't take the pawn. Instead, he defends this square. And now the final move of the game, well, not the final move, but the final kind of tactic to finish it off. If you want to pause your video, try and ask yourself, how do we actually win here? And I'll give you a moment before I continue on. But I was pretty happy to find this with 21 seconds to go. I found the winning move, and here it is. Rook takes h3 check. And the beauty of this move is the king cannot move, which means he's 100% literally forced to take, at which point my rook also assists in the attack on his rook, and I can slide either the queen in with checkmate, or I could have taken with the rook, and that would also be checkmate. So that is how the game ended. Checkmate. 13 seconds to spare. I saved my pride. I showed my chess student the Sicilian in action. And this is one of the things about the Sicilian, is that it can be very, very sharp. Very, very, very sharp. Very tactical. And really potentially not that good from a beginner's perspective. This was not easy to defend from my perspective. I'm not that good at chess, but I'm not a beginner. I would say I'm a beginner to intermediate chess player. And this took, a lot of energy for me to really defend, and a lot of time on the clock to defend against these threats. And it felt very uncomfortable for a bit of time. But I was happy that I got to show my student the idea of initiative and how initiative can be developed or can be acquired through sacrifice. But if you gain initiative and you don't succeed, you don't win as a result of the initiative that you gained immediately, then there's a high likelihood that the tables will turn and your initiative will evaporate, and there'll be a very strong counterattack, as there was in this game, ultimately leading to a checkmate. Like I said, I thought this was a very nice game from the black perspective. Computer agrees that this was played quite accurately, and I'll leave it there. But if you liked this game, press like, share, and subscribe, and I'll be back again soon with some more. Thank you very much. See you then.